Let's make a quilt with Mama B. 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 Let's make a quilt with Mama B.
Hello quilters, and welcome back to Let's Make a Quilt Together, Lesson 3. And today our lesson is all about borders. And borders make a major impact on a quilt. I don't want you to think of the border as an afterthought. So we're going to spend a little time looking at some borders just to get your imagination going. And then we're going to make a border. And the first thing I want you to decide is whether or not you want to put a border on your quilt. I'm hoping that you do. As I went back through some of my quilts and looked at them, I realized I only had one that did not have a border on it. And it's this one. That's because the quilt itself was so big when I finished making it that you can see all I did was put a binding on it at the end. And the black binding stands out because all of the colors of the quilt are browns, grays, and golds. And so you may decide to do something just like this if you don't want anything else to compete with what's going on the quilt surface itself. But there are other things to consider. Rarely do I have a quilt that has just one border. And I like a small inner border on my quilts because a small inner border allows me to put anything on the other side of it that I want. Here's a case in point. Notice the small inner border here. The black border is a 1/2 inch wide. And then I was able to put a piece of decorative fabric on the outside of it as the border. Sometimes you will find fabrics that are linear and that have a design that run up and down the fabric that you can cut to make into a border. Here are some fabrics. If you notice these, if I had a quilt that design would enhance, I could choose to cut it maybe 2.5 inches wide to get one of the designs, maybe 3 inches, 4 inches, whatever width I wanted. But the design is already there. I could sew it onto my quilt and make the border. Here's another one that I think is absolutely striking. Can't wait to use that as a border on a quilt. I just have to find the right quilt, and then this will be on that quilt as a border. As you're looking at fabrics, look at fabrics that have that linear design that will allow you to cut it in whatever way you like. For instance, from here to here could be a border, or just the black stripe could be a border, or just the beige, the gold and the beige could be a border. But look for fabrics that will allow you to do that if you get to a point where you think, I just can't figure out what I want to use as a border. So, sometimes you can put borders on your quilts, and you can piece the border. Notice that this border, here's the little inner border that I told you I always use. There's the little inner border, and then I took some of the fabrics that were left over from the blocks and sewed them together to make a pieced border. I even used the fabric, one of the fabrics as the binding. But you can make a pieced border as well if you have fabrics left over from the blocks you've made. Here's another pieced border. This particular quilt has greens, all of these shades of green in it. And I just cut the little pieces that were left into 2.5 inch squares, pieced them together, and they now run around the perimeter of the quilt. So that's another idea that I want you to think about when you're thinking about the border of the quilt that you have, sometimes you can have more than two borders. And I've done that several times. Here's one that has 3 borders. The inner border is black. There's another little beige border, and then a 4.5 inch wide color border. And this color border picks up the colors that are on the surface of the quilt. This is one that only has the 2 borders. But notice that the colors in the on the surface of the quilt are so vibrant that I used a beige border beside the inner border, used a beige border to help just enhance those colors. And your border can do that. It can compete with your quilt, which you don't want. It can enhance the quilt, which is what you do want. Or the border can be the show itself. Let's see, I've got one. Based on the fabrics that you choose, this quilt is primarily black, but look at the border. The border just sings and dances and just ignores the black entirely. Some of these colors are in the quilt, but the border just really makes this quilt what it is. I love this quilt. Sometimes I got it. Okay. Sometimes you can use the fabric that's in the blocks to enhance the border. For instance, this fabric is mostly medallions. You can see the beautiful gold, white, and black medallions. And so to enhance the border, I cut one of the whole medallions, part of another medallion, and put this little design on each quarter. That's something else you can think about. How do you want to enhance the border? I have an inner border. Of course, I told you I always have an inner border. The gold is sashing, the white is an inner border, and the black is the border with the enhancement at each of the 4 corners. And it's just so easy to do with all of the great products we have for applique in this day and time. Another idea for you to think about for your border of the half triangle quilt you're making. Sometimes I got a little carried away. I made this quilt some time ago. It's made of African fabrics, and it didn't work out to be the size that I wanted. So I ended up putting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 borders on it. And once I did that, it was the size that I wanted. I really love this quilt too. I just finished saying to my son how much I love some of my quilts. This is another one. But you can see how the borders work together, and this quilt really needed these 5 borders. And that's something else that I want to remind you of. Your quilt sometimes tells you what it needs or what it wants. Look at the quilt. Once you've put that quilt top together, and then you can decide what exactly you're going to use as the border and how many borders you will use. Just a couple others. I don't use white very much, as you've noticed, I'm sure. But then I got to this quilt. It had a lot of white in it, and I couldn't put just a white border on it. So I had to choose the red, the blue, and the green to separate the white sashing from the border out here. And so here is another example of what you can do with your border. Sometimes you will also look at the size of your quilt to determine the size of the border. Big quilts, you can make big borders. Little quilts, not so much. So you want to be aware of that as well. You don't want the border to be little and skimpy and looking like an afterthought, but you do want the border to enhance what's going on the quilt. And if it doesn't enhance it, it ought to be the star. Maybe your quilt can support what's going on in the border. But they're there together. One should help the other. One should be supportive of the other. And then, you know, you've got a complete, gorgeous product. So, enough about my borders. Let's get busy and make some borders now. Yep, okay. Okay guys, now we're ready to make some borders and get them attached to a quilt. The first thing you have to do in order to get your borders is determine how many strips of fabric you need to make the border. Now I have a miniature quilt on the table to demonstrate this. You're going to do this with your quilt. When we want to know the perimeter of the quilt, because the border goes around the perimeter of the quilt, and so we need to know what that distance is in order to cut strips to fit it. So the first thing you're going to do is measure your quilt. Measure the width of the quilt in the middle. That's your more accurate measurement. Do not measure it on the end, on either end, but you measure across the middle. And you're going to jot that number down. And then you're going to measure the length of your quilt across the middle and jot that number down. Now you have a length and a width. But remember, you have two widths. So whatever your first number was, you need to multiply it times 2. And whatever your second number was, also multiply that times 2. Add those two products up, and the total that you get is the total perimeter of your quilt. Now, when we're cutting those strips, we know that the quilting fabric is approximately 42 inches wide. In fact, we're going to go with 42. So now we need to know how many times do I cut strips of fabric across the width in order to get the number of strips that I need for my quilt. And so here we go. You can bring the camera down on this. Okay, let's say that when you measured the width of your quilt, you got 62 inches. So I'm going to put in 62 inches. And since I have two lengths that are 62 inches, so the combined width of my quilt is 124 inches. Then I measure the length. And let's say that the length of my quilt was 86 inches. And we multiply that times 2. That's 172 plus the 124 that I had, and 296 inches represents the total perimeter of my quilt. Now I need to know how many strips to cut. It doesn't matter how wide your quilt is, how wide your border is, What matters is how many of these strips do you need to go around the quilt. So I'm going to divide this number, 296, by 42, because 42 inches is what I'm going to have as the length of each strip. That says I need 7 strips plus some more. So in my case, I would cut 8 strips of border fabric. You see that on your handout, and you just saw me do it here. But once again, measure your quilt across the width, double that number. Measure your quilt across the length, double that number. Add the two together, the numbers that you got when you doubled them, and then divide that sum by 42. and that will tell you the number of strips to cut. And since when I divided, I had some digits left over, some decimal digits left over. That tells me I need a little more than 7 strips, so I'm going to cut 8 strips to fit a quilt that I mentioned here in the example. Look at your handout, and you can look at this part of the video again and see how that's done. That's how you're going to get an accurate length of strips for your perimeter. Okay, cutting the strips. Okay, when you get ready to cut the strips, you're going to lay your fabric down so that the length is going away from you and you're facing the width of your fabric, because it's the width of the fabric that we want to cut. Now in this case, I've already straightened this fabric, but I've left the selvages on. And I do that because I don't want my fabric to start to ravel when I'm not using it. And so I won't cut the selvages off until I have actually cut the strips. So let's say that I'm going to make a border, an inner border, that is 1 inch wide. If that's the case, I have to cut strips that are 1.5 inches so that they will sew down to 1 inch. So here we go. I'm going to measure 1.5 inches. Nice sharp blade in the rotary cutter. And here is my first strip. And let's say I know that I need 8. I'm not going to cut 8 right now, but I am going to cut another one just so that you can see it. And let's say now that I've cut all of those 1.5 inch strips I need. This is when I take the selvages off. I stack my strips, and I do this whether it's 2 strips, 8 strips, or 9 strips. I stack them. If it's 9, I stack them 3, 3, 3. And I take the selvages off like so, making sure that the ruler is level with the one line on the ruler is level with the edge of the strip, because I want a nice straight cut. And selvage is gone. Okay, I already have some strips cut. So now I want to go to the sewing machine to show you how I put my strips together, and I want to show you how to sew them so that you don't keep sewing them individually, but you want to just keep sewing, 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 and there's an easy way to do that. As you see in your handout, you're supposed to sew your strips so that they are right sides together. Here we have a strip of fabric. I'm going to take another strip of fabric and I'm going to put them right sides together at an angle, because you want to make a mitered angle in sewing these strips together. There they are, right sides together, forming a right angle. There's the right angle there. And I'm going to put a couple of pins. Remember, you can't ever have 2 pins. I'm a real proponent of using pins. Now what I want to do is sew from this corner out here to this corner that's down here. It's hard to see, but I managed to keep an eye on it. Okay, so we're going to assembly line sew and get these strips sewn together. Here we go. Now as I sew, I lift this one up a little bit so that I can keep my eye on this corner down here, because I'm sewing toward that corner. And there I am. Now, We're not going to take this off of the machine and cut it and do all those things yet. I'm going to take this strip, turn it up so I can see the right side, and attach another strip to it. And once again, I'll put a couple of pins. Don't worry about the thread that's connecting these. We will clip all of that in a little while. And I want to sew from that upper corner, upper left-hand corner, down to the bottom right-hand corner. And I keep an eye on the corner to which I'm sewing. And I have those strips joined. Now we'll do one more, just so you get the idea. Of course, this one doesn't want to cooperate, but I'm going to make it do that. All right, once again, upper left-hand corner, down to the lower right-hand corner. And you can see that little corner to which I'm sewing. Now,
do you have one more you can do? Oh, that was it.
I'm going to show it with the black in a minute.
Okay, because I can get a better angle on that side, I think.
All right, well, if you wanted to come around it.
Well, you got more to do on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now I want to cut these apart. Take the pins out. And you'll see all of our strips have been sewn together. We have one long border strip. And we didn't keep taking them off, putting them on, taking them off. The next thing I'm going to show you is how to do this with a fabric that does not have a definite right and wrong side. It's easier to see it when it has a definite right side and a definite wrong side. But I'm going to show you how to do it with this black fabric that it's hard to tell the right side from the wrong side. But the process is just as easy. Okay, now we're going to use a black fabric, and it is very difficult to tell the difference between the wrong side and the right side, except you have one important cue. Notice that we have this little fold here. And if you will use that fold the way I'm about to show you, you will sew these just as easily as I sewed the ones earlier that had a definite right side and wrong side. I know the fold is to the right side. Say that again. I know the fold is to the right side. So as I open this strip up, I'm going to keep the fold facing me so that I know I have the right side. The same thing happens when I put another piece on. Since the fold is to the right side, here's that fold, I know that I want to lay the fabric on here just like this to get right sides together. Keep that fold always in mind because it's going to help you to assembly line sew these together. And we can put a couple of pins if that will help. Sometimes I pin, sometimes I don't. Depends upon how I'm feeling that day. But you can see I always keep a little thing of pins on my sewing machine. Okay, here we go. Upper left-hand corner. Lower right-hand corner, to the lower right-hand corner. And you don't have to rush. This is not a race. You want to be accurate as you can possibly be. And notice it just sews right through that corner. Now, I know that this is the wrong side. I'm sewing on the wrong side because I had right sides together. I'm going to pick this up, find my fold. There's the fold. That tells me that I need to turn this so that the fold is facing me, and I'll have right side up, and here's the next strip. That's why that little fold is so important. And see the fold, right sides together, no problem. And I can continue to sew these assembly line sew without any issues. I take a few stitches, then I make sure that I'm all lined up to hit that angle right there, because that's what I want to do. And I just sew it slowly. This is not a time to rush. This is a time to make sure you're accurate. And I sew right through that corner. And now I'm ready to attach another one. The fold is down, so I want the fold up. Now I know I've got the right side facing me, and I can put the right side of the next strip on the right side of the one that was just sewn. And here we go again. Upper left-hand corner, down to the lower right-hand corner, keeping everything straight and lined up. This is an important skill to have because you're going to use it over and over again. If you were going to make one of those jelly roll quilts, this is just what you would do with all the strips that are in the jelly roll. Sew them together end to end, making this mitered mitered stitch. So let's cut these apart. Take the pins out. And I tend to keep this all together until after I have pressed it. So the next thing we're going to do is go to the ironing board. I'll show you how to press this, and then when and how to trim this excess seam allowance. All right, now we're at the ironing board, and I want to show you how I press these. I'm not going to say this is the only way, but this works for me. I press from the right side. I told you that when we were pressing blocks earlier. And I pull this toward me. And when I get to one of the seams, I just press it over, and I just keep pulling it toward me. Now here's one that wasn't sewn well. And the fact that I don't cut anything until after I have pressed it leaves me the opportunity to take this loose and re-stitch it so that it is sewn properly. And you know that it's not sewn well because you can see all of that seam allowance back there. These two edges don't meet. And I did that on purpose so that you guys would know you haven't done anything to it that you can't undo. So what I would do if I had the time, but I won't take time now during the filming, I would sit down, take the stitches out, realign these, re-stitch it, and then it would be just as I need it to be. So let's look at the black fabric, because I didn't deliberately make a mistake there. If I did, it wasn't, if I made a mistake, it wasn't on purpose. Okay, pulling it toward me. And it doesn't matter that I have that light thread in there. That's not going to be an issue. And I'm still pulling it. There's another seam. Okay, now I'm ready to go back and trim the seam allowances. And I know that I want the seam allowance to be about 1/4 of an inch wide. And so once I know that all of my seams are correct, then and only then do I cut seam allowances. Some people who are braver than I am cut their seam allowances first before they press. Well, like I said, I'm not that brave because if I make a mistake, I want to have plenty of fabric to go back and correct that mistake. So that's how you're going to do your strips for your border. They can be as wide or as narrow as you want. If you wanted a wider border, you would just cut a wider piece of fabric. Always add 1/2 inch to whatever width you want. If you wanted a 5-inch border, make sure you cut the strip 5.5 inches. Sew them together just as I demonstrated, and you get that nice long border. So now that we have the border, we have to attach it to the quilt and press the seam allowances. So I'm going back to the sewing machine to show you that. All right, here's our little sample quilt, and I had previously cut some border strips for that sample quilt. And you'll remember that in your handout it tells you to roll up your strips so that you can control them better. That's what I've done with these. And I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew the strips on the sides first. Then we come back and we sew the top and the bottom. You want to make sure that your seam allowances don't turn over as you're stitching. So feel the seam allowances as you go so that they stay in the direction to which you have pressed them. When you're sewing this border on, make sure the seam allowances don't flip over, the seam allowances on the back, because sometimes they will. The feed dogs will turn them over. And you want them to lay in the direction to which you have already pressed them. So be aware of that, and make sure that they don't flip. Right now I'm sewing in the direction to which mine have been pressed, and that's not an issue. But when I put the other side on, it's going to be something that I have to be very, very aware of. When you get to the end of this seam, you do want to back up a little bit, so that you can seal in the stitches. Now you're wondering about cutting this tail off. It's not that easy, not that difficult. Lay your quilt down. I just lay it down, and I make sure that the bottom is even, and I cut even with the bottom of the quilt top. And I use my scissors. If you're confident enough to use your rotary cutter, that's fine. I'm not that confident. And if there's a little bit cut over, that's okay. It's going to be taken up when I sew the bottom border on. Okay, let's get the next border on the other side. And I'm doing this because I want to show you how to press these when it's all done. Stop right here and share something with you. Here you see a seam allowance in the border, and it's that mitered seam allowance that we created. The reason we do that in the border and in the binding, once that's pressed flat, it is not obvious, and our eyes sometimes just miss that completely. If you had made a cut and sewed it horizontally across, that's a place that the eye would rest and it would stand out on your quilt, and you would be so unhappy with it. That's the reason we use that mitered seam so that it does not cause a place for the eye to stop. It's not distracting, and it tends to blend in, and it makes it easier for the eye to look at your quilt. And you do want your quilts to be seen. You've put in all this hard work, you've bought all this great fabric, so you want someone to see. And here's the seam allowance that's trying to turn over. You want someone to look at your quilt and take time to enjoy your hard work and your efforts. And once again, we're going to cut this tail that we've created. This is extra extra border, I'm sorry. I'm rushing things, putting the binding on your quilt already. And we're not quite there yet. Won't be long though. Now we're going to the sewing machine, and I'll show you how to press these. We're going to the ironing board, and I'll show you how to press these. I can't believe I said that. We don't iron at the sewing machine. All you have to do is just walk back over here.
Okay. Okay.
I'm going to clean this up a little bit. I've got all these little thread tails hanging out, and I do want to get rid of those. And so now we're going to press. Remember, the first thing you want to do is secure the stitches. So we press down on this just like we sewed it. Now you're going to press this so that the seam allowance goes toward the border. If you just turn that border over, and you've got a nice seam there. I've got some threads here that I don't want. And I'm ready to do the same thing to the other side. I'll clean up some threads. By the way, you want to do that as you go along. I should not have had all those threads there. And then secure your stitches. And now we're ready to just press that seam allowance toward the border. And we've got the side inner borders on. Now we just need to put the inner border at the top and the inner border at the bottom. Let's do that. Always keep in mind that every border you add makes your quilt bigger. So if you're a person who tends to like smaller quilts, you may have borders, but you may have narrow borders. I'm a person who likes big quilts, so I make the gigantic borders. Making sure that seam allowance underneath doesn't pop up. I want that to stay down the way I pressed it. It just makes quilting the quilt a lot better if seam allowances behave. And pretty soon you will be quilting this, or you will send it to someone to have it quilted. We will be talking about that. Okay. Here we go again. We've got a tail to cut off. And I use my scissors. I don't use my rotary cutter. I just make sure that everything is flat. And I cut right down beside that side border. Okay, let's get the one on the bottom. And then I'm going to show you the other little samples that I have that are all finished so that you can get started putting your border on. You've seen enough of me today, so now you need to do what you've seen me do. And I just kind of stop along the way. Make sure you have right sides together. Our seams to our border should be facing you. If it's not, get your seam ripper out. Take it off and redo it. That's why all of us have seam rippers. They're like erasers on the top of a pencil. You could also pin this. I tend not to pin it, and I guess that's because I've put so many of them on. But if you're not comfortable sewing it the way that I'm sewing it, please, please, please feel free to pin it. You want to do what you need to do to make sure you're as successful as possible. Now, that's the top and the bottom on. We're going to press them the exact same way that we pressed the two sides. So we'll go to the ironing board and press these two borders. I'm going to clean it up a little bit like I did before. I have the extra threads. And let's make sure we put our seal our stitches. And we want to press the seam allowance toward the border. And you can see how this black is enhancing this little quilt already. Let's clean it up. And here we have an inner border on this little quilt. And I won't sew anymore, but suppose I wanted to go a little bit further. And we could put this as an outer border. And I would do it the very same way. I would sew the two pieces on the sides, and then I would sew the top and the bottom. And I have a couple of little quilts here that I've already done that I want to talk to you about, just to give you a couple of more ideas about putting your border on. All right, in your handout on page 9, you see one way that we can attach a border, and I've done that here on this little quilt, and I want to talk to you about it. The first thing I did was I cut a strip of fabric of the white for an inner border. And that's what you see happening here on page 9 in your handout. Put the two sides on, then the top and the bottom. And so there's the white border, white inner border that's in your handout. Then I took two other strips, a blue and a gold. I sewed them together lengthwise, and then I put them on the quilt, and they are represented here. This is one side. This is the other side. Here is the top, and here's the bottom. And that's the effect you get when you sew those two pieces together. And here is that little quilt that demonstrates that. Look at what happens in the corners when you sew the last two strips of border fabric together. You get, it looks like a little bar that runs through, and it's kind of an interesting effect that you get. Notice the white inner border doesn't do that, and it didn't do that because it's not sewn to the gold and the blue. But it's all by itself, and it just frames the quilt. So that's what will happen if you decide to put your border on the way it tells you in your handout. I wanted you to know the effect you get. But let's say that you don't want that effect on your quilt in the corner. So my suggestion is don't sew any of your borders together before you put them on. And here's an example. Didn't want that effect with this quilt because I love this fabric. And you can see why. And so I sewed the gray inner border on all by itself and let it frame the quilt. And then I found this beautiful batik somewhere in my stash. We won't talk about stashes. And I sewed that on the exact same way, but notice the difference. I don't have that bar effect in the corner that you have here. That's just simply not sewing the pieces together first. This is sewing the pieces together first. Two options that you have for putting borders on your quilt. And I want you to make sure you do use at least one border because I want you to have the practice of doing that. But look at your quilt top very carefully. Let your quilt top tell you how many borders, what color borders, how wide the borders are, and then proceed to follow the steps that I've demonstrated for getting the borders on your quilt. I'm looking forward to seeing these beautiful quilts, and I'm looking forward to seeing the borders that are making your quilts outstanding. Until the next time, happy sewing, guys.